What's up, everybody? Welcome back to my bonus lecture series. This is part 2 of Notable Nazis. Part 1 was all about the man himself, Adolf Hitler, kind of the ringleader. That was about a 20-minute chunk. I didn't want to make it a 35 or 40-minute long bonus lecture and scare everybody off with the length of time. But the second part should be about roughly the same amount of length as part 1. But in this one, I'm going to cover 3 of the guys that are in Hitler's inner circle. And typically in an American history class, we wouldn't really talk about or mention any of these guys. However, if you like World War II, if you like the Nazis, if you like learning about the Holocaust and these horrific tragedies from history, these guys are really very interesting, and I would recommend, what I'm going to cover today is really just going to scratch the surface on them, but there is a bale of information about all of these guys, and really just the dynamic of how they all interacted together is quite fascinating. They are a peculiar and interesting group of dudes, and awful, and also pretty epically awful and evil. So hopefully you find it interesting and engaging. You can watch one or both parts of this lecture series. Totally your call. Depends on how interested you are in the topic, and I guess how much extra credit you might need in class. So here we go. Up after Adolf Hitler. Now, this guy, Hermann Göring, or Hermann Goering, depending on how you pronounce it, I've heard people pronounce it both ways, was one of Hitler's right-hand men. For most of the war, if Hitler had died, this is the guy that would have taken control. He was often, and this kind of changes at different points in history, but for most of the war and the years leading up to it, he is Hitler's number 2 man, right-hand guy. Now, who is Hermann Goering? He is one that I think is kind of a little bit different from the rest of them, and has his own separate little, kind of spin on evilness and where his background was. Now, he was actually a great fighter pilot ace during World War I. So check him out. Here's the photo right in the middle that my cursor's on. Very handsome guy. He was known to be a decent public speaker. He was very much a schmoozer that had the gift of gab. He was personable. People generally that met him one-on-one kind of liked him and thought, oh, this guy can carry on a conversation. Very handsome too. So in the early years after World War I, when Hitler is trying to basically get a foothold on power, but he has to win elections, and things were not going good right from the start for the Nazi Party. They were really struggling to try to win seats in the German Congress, or the Reichstag it was called. One of the problems that the Nazi Party had was they were all basically commoners. Remember, Hitler came from humble roots. He was not a nobleman. He wasn't a blue blood that had the right pedigree and background. So in those early years, the Nazis needed some more credibility. And one of the things that they needed was to give them more credibility within the German system was some of these people that had the right background, the right parents, and that were in the right social circles, and that were kind of the upper crust. Hermann Goering was that guy. And he is kind of, after World War I, he also feels like Germany gets screwed. A famous story about him, when his squadron was told by the German government after the armistice and World War I is done, they were told to give all their planes over to the Allied armies and we're surrendering, and then you're going to go back to Germany. He said, basically, screw that, or the German version of it. And he told all of his guys, we're going to fly all our planes into Germany till we run out of gas. We're going to basically land them in fields, and we're just leaving the war effort, but make sure that those Allied soldiers don't get our planes. I'd rather them crash in some German field than turn them over to the Allies. So he's bitter about the way World War I panned out, and he's looking to find his place in post-World War I Germany. He's also angry, kind of mad. He had a little bit of family money, but wasn't super set where he was never had to work again kind of thing. Anyway, he and Hitler end up making buddies in the early 1920s. Now, Hitler, I didn't cover this very much, but Hitler tries to take power in the early 1920s with a putsch, it's called, or a coup, like a military takeover. They basically, kind of his thugs, his brown shirt guys that turn into the Gestapo and the SS, they try to like stage a coup and overthrow the German government. Doesn't work at all. They didn't have enough power at the time. The German authorities, who do have like the police department and very small military on their side, they squash it was called the beer hall putsch, or like the beer hall coup. They squash it pretty ruthlessly. And that's when Hitler goes and spends a year in prison. And that's where he writes his book. Well, Hermann Goering, when this all played out, he was one of Hitler's first supporters. He actually gets shot in the beer hall putsch. And then for the rest of his life, he walks with a limp. Now, he doesn't go to prison. He's able to scramble out of there. He gets a surgeon to take the bullet out of him. I guess they didn't do a great job, and he was in a tremendous amount of pain. So he was always kind of a partier. He was always kind of a glutton that liked to just, live it up. He was one of those very stereotypical flyboys. He liked to look good. He liked to see all the women. He liked to go out to the bars. Well, once he gets shot and has this horrible pain in his hip that's kind of justified from a gunshot wound and it doesn't heal up right, then he starts to get hooked on morphine and opiates. He, just like Hitler, becomes a very heavy drug addict, but and I guess that pain in his hip never goes away, and it compounds and gets worse over time. And then as he gets to be an older guy, and again to his gluttonous personality, he gets more and more heavy set. He basically he would eat and drink all day, do drugs. This is a guy that I think he is maybe the one guy in the inner circle that didn't truly believe in all of the conspiracy theories. I don't think he was all that concerned about Jews, whereas we talked about in the last lecture, I think Hitler genuinely believed the conspiracy theory stuff he was saying about Jews. I think he really, really, truly believed it, even though he's off base and it didn't add up and he's incorrect. He believed it in his mind. I think Hermann Goering, he would say the right things and he would shout propaganda and all that, but he only did it because he knew it was making the leader guy happy and it was keeping him in power. And I think he is a great example of somebody that was basically all in it for himself. He just wanted to live the high life, and he was willing to do or say whatever it took to keep himself in power and with money and satisfying all of his urges, for drugs or whatever the case may be, fine wine, women, etc. Anyway, he's in charge of the Gestapo, which is like German secret police. Now he and a couple of the other guys we're talking about, actually the next guys, Goebbels and Himmler, the two other that I'm going to profile today, they all actually hated each other. None of them trusted each other. He used the Gestapo to spy on those guys. Those guys were spying on him. It really was like a den of wolves where all of these guys are looking to stab each other in the back, and they would do whatever they took to gain favor with Hitler and to try to climb that ladder up and to be Hitler's next in line to take over. But for most of the war, Goering is the guy that would have been Hitler's successor. He does kind of fall out of favor with Hitler towards the end of the war in the last year or so, because I think Hermann Goering was the first one of the inner circle to realize by the time you get to like the end of 1943, beginning of 1941, Germany essentially had no chance of winning the war. He sees the writing on the wall in that last year or so. I don't think he was too concerned about trying to pull off a victory in the war. He thought it had become impossible at that point. And from that time on, he just parties a lot and really lives it up. And Hitler starts to notice that, and his stock starts to drop. But through the last year or so of his life, man, he really lives it up a lot, does a lot of drugs, gains a lot of weight. He also is the only guy in Hitler's inner circle that didn't get killed or commit suicide right at the end of the war. He's the only one that surrenders and actually turns himself over to the Americans and the British. He wouldn't want to turn over to the Russians because Stalin, if he found any of these guys, he was going to torture them and murder them in a horrific way. But Goering felt like he had some common ground and he could talk his way out of all this with the Americans and British, who he regarded as basically kind of reasonable. And he was thinking, hey, I'm going to go sweet talk these guys. I don't think he had any idea how epically mad the British and Americans were at the Nazi regime. But he thought in his mind he was going to be able to talk his way out of it, go through a show trial, and then maybe he would be the new leader after World War II of a new kind of like American, British, or Allied dominated Germany. As the trial goes on, he realizes that's not going to happen. That the Americans and British, I mean, we give him a fair trial, but there's overwhelming evidence that he committed a lot of war atrocities, and he realizes we're going to execute him. And actually, he makes friends with an American prison guard while his trial's going on in late 1945. Maybe this was even 1946 now after the war is done. And he doesn't want to get publicly executed, get hung, with his photo out. So he actually talks that prison guard who spoke fluent German. He becomes friends with him. Remember, he's a schmoozer. He's a good talker. And he gets that prison guard to bring him cyanide tablets. And he actually eventually does commit suicide in his room, which a lot of the Nazis end up committing suicide using these cyanide tablets, but he was the last to do so. He never kind of gave up hope until the very bitter end that he would be able to talk his way out of all these war crimes and go on to live a life and essentially live in the high life. But that wasn't going to happen. Next up on the list, Joseph Goebbels, or Goebbels, I hear it pronounced. There's no R in there, but usually when you hear somebody say his name, it's Goebbels. This guy was the other really good speaker within Hitler's inner circle. Hitler was an epically good speaker. He was great at whipping a crowd up. Goebbels was the other one that was a great speaker too, very much in the same style as Hitler. Like if Hitler couldn't make it to a certain big gathering where you're speaking to a stadium of people, Goebbels is the guy that he would send in. Goebbels was also the propaganda minister. So like when you see those old World War II propaganda films or posters, the ones that show Jews as like evil bankers that are coming to steal your child at night, things like that. He's the guy that's behind all that. He realized how important like information and media was early on. He convinces Hitler of this, and he is one of Hitler's longest supporters, like from way back in the 1920s. A very young Joseph Goebbels who leaves college to come follow Hitler in the Nazi Party. He gets pretty tight with Hitler, and Hitler trusts him. He's definitely within his inner circle there. He convinces Hitler how important it is to take control of the newspapers, the radio stations, to just run a very effective, make films and stuff that you're going to put out to the people that will motivate them to fight a war like this and to convince them of how evil the Jews are and how the Jews are out to get us and all that. So even though most of his propaganda is like total nonsense, I will say I think he did a pretty effective job of getting the German populace to buy into the Nazi Party like philosophy and ideology. So anything that you would have heard by 1934 on in Germany on a radio station, read in a newspaper, all gets monitored by this guy and people that work directly and report directly to him. He also had a really big family. Now, that's not his family. This is in the 1930s. He ends up having, I think it was 5 daughters and a son, so like 6 kids. I remember how I said that a lot of the Nazis end up taking cyanide tablets at the end. Well, this guy is literally one of Hitler's most loyal supporters. In the closing days of the war, when Germany has lost and the Russian army is coming into Berlin and surrounding them, most of the leaders like Goering, they scatter. Hermann Goering, he heads the other way and wants to get captured by the Americans and British. No way is he going to get caught by the Russians because he knows how ruthless the Russians and Stalin are going to treat any of these guys if they find them. Well, Goebbels, even his wife, who was like super close with Hitler, Magda Goebbels, she said she didn't even want to live or have her children live in a world without National Socialism. National Socialism is like the Nazi Party. Nazi is an acronym. So they are the last of Hitler's inner circle that are hiding out with Hitler in the bunker under Berlin, as you can hear the Russian army and shells going off above ground. He is the last of the inner circle to stay with Hitler till the very bitter end. He doesn't kill himself until Hitler does. I haven't gone over that yet, but basically Hitler, he marries his longtime girlfriend on the last day of his life. He then gives her a cyanide tablet, shoots her in the head, takes a cyanide tablet himself, also shoots himself in the head, and then a couple of his closest bodyguards go and cremate the body because he didn't want Stalin to take his body and put it on display and humiliate him after his death. Well, Goebbels essentially does the same thing. Check this out. I do think too that like Goebbels was a true believer in the Nazi cause, and he truly hated Jews and believed in the conspiracy theories and all that, just like Hitler did. He actually makes he doesn't tell his kids they're doing this, but he tells them they're giving them vitamins or something. But he basically gives all of his children cyanide tablets. The whole family dies. And his wife does, and then he does. So it's a family suicide pact, and down in the bunker, and they die and commit suicide right after Hitler does. Think about that. I know you guys aren't parents yet, but man, I am. I can't imagine giving my kids cyanide and killing them for, I mean, what a horrific thing. Now, I don't know anything about his kids, but they're children. You know what I mean? You'd think, yeah, maybe Joseph Goebbels and his wife, their time's done. But man, wouldn't you try to get your kids over to the American and British side and give them a chance at a life? But again, they're true believers, and they both kind of agreed that they didn't want their children to live in a world that didn't have Nazism out there. That's how very much they were wrapped up into this and believed it. All right, well, next up, the last guy that I'm covering for you of Hitler's inner circle is Heinrich Himmler. This guy was actually like his school teacher. He was a Taluki type guy. I believe he was a like grammar German, like think of it like Mr. Spinks, an English teacher. I believe he was a German school teacher, teaching kids how to read and write and stuff, and covered some history. And then he is one of Hitler's early followers too, from back in the 1920s. Kind of a nerdy, booky little dude. That also, I think, was a true believer in Nazism. And I think he was a guy that never would have had power in his life if it hadn't have been for him getting in with Hitler and then Hitler, rising to power. He is a very kind of modest, meek dude that once he gets a little bit of power, he loves it and he wants to use it and wield it and punish his enemies. So this guy, Heinrich Himmler, is kind of the head of like the secret police or the SS, where sometimes in movies you'll see guys with those little like lightning bolt things on their lapels. You see that in a lot of World War II movies. The SS, or the Schutzstaffel, is like the most hardcore of Nazi soldiers. Those are the guys, the units in the German army that are the true believers. And man, they are very intense Nazis. They're the black shirts. So the regular German army would wear kind of green. The SS units would wear all black, and they had skulls and those lightning bolts on them. They would also take SS guys and put them in regular German units to make sure the other German soldiers are being loyal. Actually, my grandpa Stan, who was in Patton's army right through to the end of the war, he told me, and this is kind of eye-opening story that I heard from him when I was a little kid, that he captured many German soldiers, my grandpa in his unit. And even though Hitler had given the order to fight to the death, your average German soldier, unlike the Japanese, wasn't going to fight to the death. They would surrender. They wanted to live, to see another day. They were not necessarily all in on like Nazism and the cause, but the SS guys were. And my grandpa said when they, towards the end of the war, would get whole like units, maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 guys at a time, German soldiers that were surrendering, that even the average German soldiers didn't like these SS guys because they had been bullies to him for years, and that these guys would take off their SS uniforms and dress like a normal soldier, but the regular German soldiers would point them out and say SS, SS. And my grandpa said that even though this is technically a war crime, it was very common that, he said he never did this, but the commanding officer would say something like, "Who wants to take out the garbage?" when they would get these guys in. And most of the normal German soldiers would have all their weapons taken off and stuff and be escorted to the prison camp. But the SS guys, they would take volunteers, and any American soldier or British soldier that wanted to would take these guys around back and shoot them, because it was looked at that like these were the most hardcore of hardcore Nazis, and there was no rehabilitating them. Well, this guy, Heinrich Himmler, is the leader of the Schutzstaffel and the most hardcore Nazis. He also hates Goebbels. He hates Goring. He does not like them. The feeling is mutual. These guys do things for years and years to undermine the other one. They're constantly jockeying for power and trying to be Hitler's right-hand man. Towards the end of the war, like Hitler always very much liked this guy. He also is maybe the most rabid anti-Semite bunch other than Hitler, where he truly believed, I think, Jews were out to like ruin the world and that they're evil and nefarious and all that. This is the guy, if you are writing down any notes or anything, he's the guy that puts together the Holocaust, essentially. He's the guy that's in charge of carrying all that out and figuring out how can we exterminate millions and millions of Jews and cremate the bodies and all that. He's the guy, it's his department that crunches the numbers. I had mentioned also the Einsatzgruppen and the mobile killing squads. The Einsatzgruppen were SS units. So responsible for a ton of horrific war crimes. In the very end of the war, when Hitler's about to commit suicide and a couple weeks leading up to that, Hitler starts hearing rumors that the SS are defecting, and he thinks that Himmler is disloyal at that point. So Himmler was the one that gave Hitler the cyanide tablets. Hitler is worried that the cyanide tablets had gone bad and were not effective. So actually, Hitler gives one to his dog first. It does work. It kills Hitler's dog, Blondie. And then he uses them on his wife and him and the whole Goebbels family too. But Himmler was actually trying to escape, and he had kind of split as everything was collapsing. And he tries to make it, I think, to a U-boat. He's getting out to a shipyard and was going to get on a U-boat and try to disappear. Before that can happen, basically units of the Russian army kind of surround them. They pinch him down. They didn't realize it was Heinrich Himmler in there. They just thought it was German soldiers, but Himmler ends up, they're pretty sure, taking a cyanide tablet and killing himself too, right in the closing days of the war. So here, this PowerPoint hits some of Hitler's inner circle. Know that there are quite a few more guys. There's about 10 dudes that I'd say that are in Hitler's inner circle. But these are three of the most notable ones that you'll see in movies and pop culture, and some of the most epically evil ones. So hopefully you found it interesting and engaging. Hopefully I gave you some new material on these really, really bad dudes that you hadn't heard before. And I hope it was, interesting for you. And if you have any questions, any comments, anything like that, let me know. Send me an email, contact me. I'm happy to discuss it further with you because, like I said, everything World War II related, but especially even the Nazis, Holocaust, all this, I find fascinating and love discussing it and covering it with you guys. So that's what I got for you for today. Take care. Have a good one. See y'all soon.